Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us for this installment of the Exploring Sustainable Seafood virtual panel series. My name is Kim Thompson, and I am the director of the Aquarium of the Pacific Seafood for the Future program. We've all been trained to avoid politics at the dinner table, but the reality is we can't escape politics. Politics play a critical role in sustainable development. Today, we're going to be discussing how laws and regulations affect sustainable development of marine aquaculture or seafood farming in U.S. marine waters. We have with us today three amazing expert panelists who are going to be discussing this topic. I'm pleased to welcome Stephanie Otts from the National Sea Grant Law Center at the University of Mississippi School of Law, Nicola Ulibarri, and I think I just butchered that, I'm sorry, Nicola, from the University of California, Irvine, and Sean McNally, a PhD candidate at the University of Massachusetts, Boston. You can find their bios and additional resources from this discussion at aquariumofpacific.org. So let's start digging in by getting to know a little bit about our panelists. Stephanie, we're going to start with you. Tell us a little bit about your work, what you're working on, and is what you do now even closely related to what you thought you were going to be doing when you first applied to college?
Thanks, Kim. I'm excited to be here participating in the panel. So I'm an environmental attorney specializing in ocean and coastal law. And here at the National Sea Grant Law Center, we conduct research to improve understanding of how existing laws and policies are affecting the management of our ocean and coastal resources. It's not at all what I thought I would be doing when I applied to college. At that time, I wanted to work with the killer whales at SeaWorld. And so that was my dream from the time I was a kid. So I started college as a marine biology major, but after struggling like so many of us do with organic chemistry, I ended up as a history major and eventually decided to go to law school to study environmental law, but with a desire to work on ocean issues. And so I'm happy to have been able to find a spot that allows me to do that.
I'm right there with you with organic chem. It was my killer of my marine biology dreams as well. Nicola, how about you? What is it that you do, and is it anywhere near what you thought you were going to be doing when you first applied for college?
Right. So I research environmental planning, policy, and regulations, mostly around freshwater and coastal resources and infrastructure. And really, the goal of my work is looking at how people make decisions about the environment and finding ways to make those decisions more equitable, more sustainable, and more efficient. When I was applying for college, I was interested in how people relate to the environment, um, mostly through a sort of cultural lens. So I actually did anthropology for undergrad. And I think really the big question in how do we relate to the environment hasn't shifted. The focus on policy and on infrastructure is definitely not something I could have foreseen when I was a teenager. Um, but the big questions that interest me have been constant, I think, for a very long time.
And that's great. And I think that's something we forget about when we think about conservation is it's all about people at the end of the day, right? And how do we interact with the environment? And that's how we're going to make change moving forward.
Exactly. Yeah.
So Sean, our PhD candidate, how about you? What kind of research are you working on, and is it anywhere close to where you thought you were going to be when you first applied to college?
Yeah. So I mean, I guess I can describe myself as a soon-to-be PhD. But my work is so my PhD is in marine science and technology at the University of Massachusetts Boston, and my work primarily focuses on the science and policy of inshore shellfish resources for the state of Massachusetts. And within that, I'm looking at kind of what sustainability is in a broad sense, specifically as it relates to regulations, specifically for shellfish aquaculture in the state, but then also looking at how shellfish aquaculture is managed by the growers themselves through best management practices and global certification schemes.
Great. And certifications certainly play a really big role. And unfortunately, we won't touch upon those in this part of the series, but hopefully in the future. But we're excited to learn more about your work. But
Yeah, I'm excited to share.
let's get started by looking at the bigger picture. So the US is globally recognized as a leader in environmental regulation. A lot of people are familiar with landmark regulation like the Clean Water Act and the Endangered Species Act. There are some environmentalists who agree with this characterization, and they advocate for developing more in the US where we do have these strong environmental protections. However, we have some counterparts in the environmental community who are also concerned that our environmental regulations don't go far enough, and they urge caution on further development. Nicola, let's start with you. Do US regulations live up to the hype? Does the US really lead the world in terms of environmental regulation?
So I don't know about lead the world just because I don't do global research. But the US does have really, really strong environmental regulations. So you mentioned Clean Water Act, Endangered Species Act, a number of these sort of landmark laws that were enacted in the late 1960s, early 1970s. And they have done a remarkable job at cleaning up our environment and protecting the environment. And so, for instance, one of the triggers of the Clean Water Act was a pretty famous event when the Cuyahoga River in Cleveland lit on fire because it was so polluted. And we no longer have rivers that light on fire, and so these laws have done a great job at targeting the large scale pollution and ecosystem devastation that our long-standing industrialization and development had caused. A lot of the critiques are saying they're not doing enough. And so, for instance, if you look at the Clean Water Act, we still see that half of our rivers and streams, and I think almost 2/3 of bays and estuaries still don't have sort of what's called fishable, drinkable quality. So they're technically impaired and polluted. When it comes to Endangered Species Act, there are still hundreds of species that are listed and are not necessarily recovering to the point where they can be removed and considered safe. And so when you're looking at the critiques, it's people looking at the failures. When you're looking at the success stories, it's saying we're doing a lot better than we would be without these laws.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, there's absolutely room for improvement, and it's not a perfect system, but it's still a great system that has greatly improved our environment from pre-regulation to post-regulation.
Absolutely, yes.
And Stephanie, do you have anything to add to that?
I agree that if you look at where we were in the late 60s and early 70s, we've come a long way. But I think the other challenge is that we've addressed a lot of the low hanging fruit, in the sense that a lot of the pollution at that time was industrial pollution. So paint manufacturers dumping paint directly into rivers and things that were very visible. And now our environmental challenges are much harder to see sometimes, like microplastics. And so that can, also pose a real challenge for the environmental laws that really haven't been updated much since their passage in the 70s.
So from what you guys are saying, we do have this robust environmental regulatory framework. It does do a decent job, but we do have some of our colleagues in the environmental community still arguing that we don't have adequate regulations to responsibly grow and expand marine aquaculture in U.S. waters. Stephanie, are they right? Is the answer to develop new regulations for marine aquaculture, or should we be revisiting the existing regulations and working to improve those for implementation for marine aquaculture?
Great. Yeah, thanks, Kim. Yeah, I think this is actually a really challenging issue and a challenging question to think about. And some of where you might fall on, the various sides of this is how you just feel about how federal agencies should work and how federal policy kind of is implemented. But as Nicola discussed, the United States has pretty strong environmental laws on the books, at least. We may have some implementation challenges. And many of those environmental laws, as we'll talk about, apply to aquaculture operations. However, those laws and many of the agency regulations were not written with aquaculture in mind. And the agencies that do currently have authority to permit aquaculture in federal waters, like the Environmental Protection Agency and the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, don't have that much experience or knowledge of marine aquaculture operations, certainly offshore. And the agency that a lot of us think of as having that aquaculture expertise, NOAA, only has an advisory role in the permitting process with respect to threats to like protected resources like marine mammals, whales. And so that current state of affairs raises two big issues or concerns. First, as you mentioned, some worry that the potential environmental impacts that are specific to marine aquaculture would not be adequately addressed going through this process with the current agencies in charge. And then second, from more of the industry side of things, navigating that existing permitting process can be challenging just because there's lots of agencies involved and there's a lack of experience in writing permits for marine aquaculture operations. And that is not a new phenomenon. It's always hard to be the first project right out of the gate. If you think about Cape Wind and offshore wind resources, like anytime you're the first project, it's going to be challenging. And so to address these concerns, some organizations are calling for new legislation that would put NOAA in charge of aquaculture permitting and impose conditions that are specific to addressing impacts from aquaculture. However, you could address these concerns about permitting gaps and inefficiencies without additional legislation, but it would require federal agencies to work better together and possibly issue new or revised regulations to really address the aquaculture concerns.
And Sean, do you want to add to the discussion about the current state of regulatory affairs and whether or not we need new regulation?
Yeah, no, I completely agree with Stephanie in that the current structure of environmental regulations contains everything we need for aquaculture, but aquaculture was just thought of kind of secondary to that, and a lot of those regulations are focused on fisheries management with aquaculture as a secondary to it, and as well as even agriculture for feed issues around it. So in thinking about what we need to do for future regulations, we need to really look at where those gaps are, like Stephanie mentioned, and if it can be addressed. So what we're really missing is a solid policy framework that brings all those pieces together, that makes all of those federal agencies work in a cohesive manner.
So based on what you two are saying is that we could work with the existing infrastructure that exists. It's just a matter of getting the agencies to work better, more cohesively together to move this forward, and also ensuring that aquaculture is included in language when we talk about our food system. So if we talk about agriculture, when we talk about fisheries, aquaculture needs to be integrated into those systems. Am I capturing that correctly?
Yeah, I think so. And I think building on what Sean said, also, we don't really have consensus about what the scope of like concerns or impacts or issues that need to be addressed. So we don't have that policy, that overarching policy framework that could help the agencies identify what the goals are, what the concerns are, so that when they're implementing their decisions, they're kind of all on the same page.
So we need it in writing.
We need something in writing. Yes.
Need everything
and some
in writing.
money.
Right.
All right. So you heard it here, folks. We need some money for aquaculture. But now I want to get a little bit more specific. So we just discussed more broadly how these regulations, environmental regulations perform, specifically how they apply to marine aquaculture. But let's talk about a recent executive order that was signed by the White House in May 2020. It was signed to promote domestic seafood production. And one of the concerns that's been raised by environmentalists, including some who I respect and admire, is that the executive order explicitly states intent to streamline regulations. Many environmentalists see streamlining generally as a way to gut regulation so that businesses can profit and the environmental protections may be removed or distorted. But Nicola, you've done some research that shows that it might be more complicated than that, and that in some cases, regulations that are too restrictive or onerous might actually have negative consequences for conservation. So, what does it actually mean when we talk about streamlining regulations? And can you paint a picture for us of what good streamlining might look like in practice and how concerned citizens might be able to identify the good streamlining versus bad?
Yes, thank you, Kim. So streamlining is generally any approach designed to make a permitting process more efficient. And so as Stephanie was mentioning, if you're building an aquaculture farm, you're going to need a lot of different permits from a lot of different agencies, federal agencies, often state agencies. You might need some local, even some local municipal permits. And it can be a really pretty burdensome and onerous process. And so when we talk about streamlining, it's basically just to find a way to often still issue those same permits, but in a more consolidated approach. And there's three general approaches that people talk about for streamlining. One is just setting really strict timelines. And so if you say you have 6 months from application to issue this decision, and implement that, enforce that is the challenge. Make people make decisions faster. A second approach is what's called a programmatic review, where essentially the permitting agencies decide on some characteristics of projects that they're willing to sign off on in advance. And so that could be related to the size, or it could be related to some features of whether particular species are present in the area or not, things like that. And then if you're proposing a new project, as long as you meet those criteria, you're kind of automatically approved without any additional review. And then the third broad approach is where you do kind of a one-stop shop for permitting. And so instead of applying separately to the Army Corps of Engineers and then separately to your state Clean Water Act agency, whoever that may be, and separately to the National Marine Fisheries Service, you instead put together one set of materials as the aquaculture developer, and those then get shuttled out for each of the individual permit reviews. So all of these approaches, when we think about the effectiveness of these approaches, the question is, do they lead to less attention to potential environmental impacts or social impacts from these projects? And so when we're talking about, for instance, on timelines, if it means that to meet this timeline, we end up checking, or the permitting agency ends up checking boxes without really reading the nuances of this particular project, then that's a concern. Whereas if it's an approach like the sort of single application, where it's less time and money for the applicant putting all those materials together, but it's still getting the same levels of review from all of the various permitting agencies, there you might see still some efficiency gains without losing attention to the potential environmental impacts.
So you're saying that streamlining, first of all, it's a complex process, right? It's not a one size fits all. There are different ways that you can do it. And ultimately, building in efficiencies to the process, as was alluded to earlier too, when you were talking about interagency collaboration, there are different mechanisms to do that, and some of them can still maintain the integrity of environmental protections while still making the process more efficient. Am I capturing that?
Yeah, definitely. And I think another concern that comes up with streamlining, and this is something that Stephanie mentioned or hinted at earlier, is when you're dealing with any sort of new infrastructure, type or new project type. And so with aquaculture, we haven't permitted a lot of aquaculture projects. That it necessarily is going to take extra attention up front to think about what are the things that we're going to require of this project, such that it isn't going to harm other things that we care about. And so one of the concerns with streamlining, if you are dealing with a new project type like aquaculture, is if you do the streamlining before you have experience permitting these things, you might end up kind of shooting yourself in the foot down the road.
And Sean, do you have anything to add to the streamlining discussion?
Yeah, I mean, I thought that was a perfect way to describe all of that. Like, I'm glad to see that, it's thought of that way by a lot of other people. And whereas, so streamlining is just, it carries a bad connotation to a lot of people, especially when it comes to aquaculture, like Nicola just mentioned, that there's no experience in doing this really yet because it's pretty new. And that a lot of agencies that are responsible, especially at the state level, they don't deal with aquaculture projects on a day-to-day basis. So when they're looking at them, they don't really have the full experience to say this might be an effect based off of a fisheries management issue. They're kind of not that they're not aware, but they just don't really apply it frequently. So it kind of lags the permitting process of that, which could extend it, which could increase timeline deficiencies and things like that. So when aquaculture proponents are talking about streamlining, they're really looking for efficient process where that also considers timelines, because it takes a lot of time and a lot of effort to put these permits together and to get to a point that you can actually apply, and it costs a lot of money. So aquaculture growers are really concerned when they submit a permit that it's going to take months and it's going to delay their whole process even longer. So when we talk about streamlining, a lot of people just want to talk about increasing efficiency as opposed to kind of the scary connotation that we're going to decrease regulation and we're not going to fully commit time to reviewing projects.
And you brought up a good point in that, and all of you have said this, both in this question and previous questions, if the agency is still very green on these issues, it's going to take them some time to get used to it and applying what they already know for implementing these specific laws and regulations specific to marine aquaculture. And you kind of touched upon this in previous answers, but I just want to capture this in a specific question. What would it take to help these agencies become more seasoned in executing these marine aquaculture permits so they are more comfortable, so it is done more efficiently, but done so in a way that does not compromise the integrity of environmental protections? Anybody want to take
I think,
I mean, yeah, go ahead.
yeah, I mean, what I think it will take is more experience permitting aquaculture projects. And the challenge there is that whoever those first movers it's going to be slower and more expensive to get those permits. And so from a sort of business competitive advantage perspective, it's really challenging. And so it's almost one where if this is something that the government wants to invest in, doing some pilot projects that include all of the permitting requirements, but that are funded in some way through, grants from the EPA or something like that, then that might help develop the expertise such that they feel more comfortable permitting other projects in the future.
Okay, so we know that we need to find a way to help get existing agencies on track to be more familiar and more comfortable with permitting specific to marine aquaculture. But let's take a step back and talk about one of the most significant and pervasive laws that tends to be a subject of great debate when we talk about streamlining, and that is NEPA, or the National Environmental Policy Act. Some of our peers in the environmental community contend that the time it takes to complete a NEPA environmental review should be a long process in order to be effective. Others claim that the process is too long and onerous, that it may discourage investors, and it could also doom opportunities for sustainable development activities like renewable energy and marine aquaculture in the U.S. So, Stephanie, can you first enlighten us on what role NEPA plays in the environmental regulatory infrastructure?
Yeah, sure. And so NEPA may be one of the, I don't know, most misunderstood or, or confusing. So NEPA requires all federal agencies to evaluate the potential environmental effects of their proposed projects on the human environment, and then to also inform the public of potential significant impacts. So there is both a kind of action by the agency to consider their impacts and then to inform the public. But the most important thing that I think people should remember about NEPA is that it's about the decision making process and not the decision. And so, as noted by the US Supreme Court, NEPA merely prohibits uninformed rather than unwise agency action. And so NEPA does not require the agency to choose the least environmentally harmful option. So it's about forcing the agencies to gather information and to evaluate what impact their actions are going to have on the environment. Of course, the hope and the goal of the statute is that by going through this process, they have to consult with other agencies like the US Fish and Wildlife Service or NOAA about endangered species, marine mammals, and then engaging with the public during public comment and notice periods that the agency will make changes that will reduce the impact. But there haven't been many academic studies really examining whether that's true, whether NEPA is living up to the goal of reducing environmental impact from federal action.
And how might, it might not be doing the job according to what you're saying in terms of reducing environmental impact, but if in theory it were doing that job, again, some environmentalists are concerned that if the review process isn't a long process, then it won't be effective. So how might the length of time it takes to complete an environmental assessment under NEPA affect how effective it is in terms of environmental protections?
Yeah, so NEPA is one of those statutes where I think there's widespread belief that the NEPA process delays projects and causes economic harm. But in my opinion, those issues are not necessarily arising from the statute itself. As I mentioned, NEPA just requires the agencies to evaluate environmental. And the vast majority of federal projects don't require a preparation of an environmental review document. So those big documents that people may have heard about, the environmental assessments or environmental impact statements, most projects don't require that. And that's because agencies can identify classes of actions that they don't believe will have significant impact, and they're referred to as categorical exclusions. And so, for instance, Department of Interior has a categorical exclusion for non-destructive data collection. So if you're doing aerial surveys or field work, you don't have to do an environmental assessment or environmental impact statement. So where the delays and costs are really coming from are the approaches that the federal agencies are now taking to produce their documents in response to almost 50 years of litigation over NEPA, and then the ever-present threat of litigation over their NEPA decisions. And so the issuance of environmental assessments and environmental impact statements are final agency actions that are subject to court review. And while only a small fraction of agency decisions are challenged in court, those court rulings have had a very big impact on how agencies approach the process. And so the average length of an environmental impact statement is now more than 600 pages because the agencies are trying to put in as much as they possibly can think of to build a record that will withstand court challenge. And even when they do that, courts might come back and say, oh, this other group says you didn't think about that. You should think about that. And then it goes back to the agency and they have to add another 100 pages to do that. So there have been some recent changes proposed by the current administration that would set page limits and time limits But getting back to what Nicola said is that you might be able to do that in some cases if it's a project that an agency has a lot of experience with. They know what the impacts are going to be. They might be able to produce a really robust document in 6 months, 3 months. But if it's a new project they're not familiar with, they don't know what the environmental impacts could be, you might be sacrificing quality and a real thorough analysis of the environmental impacts if you set an arbitrary timeline.
So just to make sure that I'm capturing what you said, and this is an important point, is that it's not the length of time it takes to complete the assessments, first of all, has not been proven as to whether or not it impacts the integrity in terms of protecting the environment. And a lot of times it's not the act itself is the reasoning for the length of time, but it's really the execution, and it's essentially politics that are driving how the review process and how long it takes to complete the review process.
Yes. Yeah. And I think if you look back at the original attendant Congress, I mean, I think there has been some scholarship that suggests that, when the act was passed, they thought an environmental impact statement might be 50 pages. It was going to be more of a cursory kind of review. But after all of these court cases where the courts are saying, no, you really have to take a hard look at the environmental impact of your decisions, that just results in longer documents, and it takes longer time to go through all of those various analyses.
One piece to add on this, simply because it's a paper that I've been working on a lot over the last couple of months. I've been working at the use of boilerplate language. So basically text that has been lifted from another document and then recycled in the same, in EIS documents specifically. And what we're finding is that, first of all, a lot of boilerplate is being used. So in some cases, like 25% of an EIS document is text that has been reused from prior documents, which is absolutely contributing to sort of their ballooning length, because also longer documents have more boilerplate proportionally. But going back to this point around needing to do more thoughtful work for new types of projects, that we are seeing more and more boilerplate used. Basically, anywhere that there's kind of a similarity to existing projects, so they're close together geographically or working in the same sort of project area, we're seeing more recycling of text and therefore probably less thoughtful treatment of the environmental impacts, versus for cases that are going to be probably taking longer because they're new infrastructure or new types of projects for these agencies. There we're seeing less boilerplate, but that also, I would say, less boilerplate probably means they're thinking about impacts more. So it's a challenging trade-off when we're thinking about efficiency versus effectiveness.
But that can also play into then what you were saying before about some of these streamlining processes, right? So if you do that one very thoughtful, very thorough environmental impact statement for kind of a group, let's say a group of leases, then you could potentially reduce the time for the individual applicants and the individual leases. Is that
exactly? And reuse some of that language even as you're doing your NEPA review.
Yeah, and Kim, and there's actually built into NEPA that structure. It's called tiering. So the agencies can do a very broad environmental impact statement. This is very common in oil and gas leasing when they are considering what gigantic lease track in the ocean to offer up. And then when the lease sales move forward and the companies actually start to explore or produce, they do a more narrow, tailored, but ideally smaller EIS. Now, we know, like mentioned, boilerplate has been revealed as a big problem in oil and gas EISs, but that structure, is a possibility for projects where you have large areas and then smaller projects happening within those predefined areas.
That's very interesting. I did not know that was built into NEPA. See, you learn something new every day.
Yeah, the Forest Service uses it a lot for timber sales as well.
Always great having a lawyer on a panel too,
The more,
especially when it comes to NEPA.
Yeah.
so I mean, this has been great, and so we've had some great discussions about streamlining, which can be a scary word for some, and we've also had some discussions about one of the most contentious environmental regulations, which is NEPA, or again, the National Environmental Policy Act. But now I want to force all of you a little bit out of your comfort zones. So I'm going to ask you to give a simple yes or no answer to the following question. You ready? Do you agree that we can streamline some of these regulations in a way that provides benefits for society and the environment? Again, we're looking for just a yes or no. Stephanie, we're going to start with you. I'm going to repeat the question. Do you agree that we can streamline some of these environmental regulations in a way that provides benefits for society and the environment?
Yes, with the caveat that as streamlining has been defined during this panel.
It's always hard to
Again,
just.
always good to have a lawyer.
All right, Sean, I'm going to ask you the question again. Do you agree that we can streamline some of these regulations in a way that provides benefits for society and the environment?
Yes.
And Nicola, do you agree that we can streamline some of these regulations in a way that provides benefits for society and the environment?
Yes.
Beautiful. All right, so let's switch gears a little bit. No more yes or no questions, I promise. And let's talk about execution. So again, we've had these great discussions, kind of bigger picture about the state of U.S. environmental regulations, bringing it down specifically to some efforts for marine aquaculture. But what does that look like in practice when we talk about streamlining for providing greater benefits for the environment and society? And how is that implemented? How is that done? So, Sean, you've been working on this question for your PhD work. So, can you tell us a little bit about this work and what were some of the conversations that you've had with your PhD advisors that got you to this point of wanting to work on this issue?
Yeah, so it's something that's come up in Massachusetts inshore shellfish aquaculture for a very long time. And again, it carries the same connotation when people hear streamlining that we've discussed on the panel already. So like Nicola mentioned with what the three aspects of streamlining are, a lot of this was the question that me and my advisor looked at is how do you coordinate that with the different agencies? So we looked at the state level specifically. And so we coordinated with the state, federal, and municipal regulators that are in charge of siting and permitting aquaculture in Massachusetts. And we basically created what we hope to be the three-tiered process that Nicola mentioned earlier. And so we started off by kind of just laying out what the process of siting and permitting of an aquaculture site in Massachusetts is. And we created this stepwise process where we got all the agencies to be involved with us to lay that process out for how they would go about reviewing a certain project. And then we created a stepwise structure for that. So just going from the start to finish in 13 steps. So in streamlining, we kind of just looked at it as like, how do we coordinate with those agencies to see what is it are they even looking at when they review these projects, and how can we ultimately work towards that one-stop process, that one-stop shop process that Nicola mentioned. And so for anyone who's interested, we created a website that is run by the Division of Marine Fisheries in Massachusetts, and it's called the Massachusetts Aquaculture Permitting Plan.org. So shout out to all of my collaborators on that project. And I really hope that people can look at this website and look at how we structured this whole program essentially to kind of grow into the steps that Nicola mentioned, but also stand on its own for what streamlining should look like.
And do you plan to, I mean, are you engaged in this work? Have you been having a good time with it? Do you plan to carry this on once you get your PhD?
Yeah, I mean, PhD is a heavy lift, so I mean, I'm totally engaged in it. I've been working on it for 5 years now, so it was a process, and it was a really, really good process, and I hope the tool at the end of the day is something that people can look towards to kind of get rid of that bad connotation of what streamlining is and what it can be, especially as it relates to shellfish aquaculture in general.
Wonderful. And as I mentioned, we are going to be including some resources on the webpage. So again, if you go to aquariumofpacific.org, you will see all of the bios for these speakers, and we will also have some of the resources and additional resources that were mentioned today. But wow, we've really covered a lot. And, Stephanie, Sean, and Nicola, I think I'm getting it right by the end. I've learned a lot from you guys about U.S. environmental regulations, and again, learning that streamlining doesn't always have to be a bad thing, and in fact, if it is done the right way, it can actually be a good thing for the benefit of society and the environment. But ultimately, there's a burning question that I have to ask, which is, can we develop a marine aquaculture sector in the U.S. that is economically sustainable, but also provides benefits to society and the environment? And can we do it now?
I thought you said no more yes or no.
That's not a yes. Well, yes, it is a yes or no, but you can add a little context to this one. I'm not holding your feet to the fire on this one. But can we responsibly produce marine aquaculture now with the knowledge and resources we have? And Sean, we'll start with you.
Yeah, I mean, I'm a firm believer in it, and I really think that we just need to create the policy framework for that to exist. Because right now, like I mentioned earlier, it is a bit fragmented, and the focus has been on other things like fisheries management and agricultural issues. So as we think about marine aquaculture and as we think about growing the industry in the United States, we really need to look at creating a strong framework for that to happen. And around that, we can start to answer those questions and go through those kind of scary NEPA processes in a way that that is structured.
And Nicola, how about you? Can we develop a responsible marine aquaculture sector in the U.S. now?
I absolutely think we can. There are two big challenges that I think need to be addressed, though. One is funding. Sean mentioned this earlier, but the regulatory agencies that we are tasking to develop this policy framework and especially to implement it need the money, the staff, and the expertise to actually do that. And so right now we are in a place where a lot of our federal agencies have been pretty gutted, have had their budgets reduced and have had their staff reduced. And so being able to really responsibly rely on the policies that exist, develop new policies and implement them well, I think will require supporting those agencies that are tasked with protecting the environment. The second big challenge, and something that we've hinted at but haven't really explicitly stated, is that a lot of the federal policies we've been talking about are actually implemented at the state level. And so things like the Clean Water Act are actually, the permits for most states are issued by your state environment department, whatever that is called. And so Sean mentioned he's developing the permitting framework for Massachusetts, and that's a Massachusetts specific toolkit that you could adapt to apply somewhere else, but it's not going to work in every other state. And there, one of the challenges that we see is that the implementation varies a lot state by state based on their capacity and really based on their kind of level of environmental will. And so if we want to do this in a responsible manner nationwide, we need to make sure that to build some capacity building and implementation help for the states that are tasked with doing this as well.
Yeah, and I think that's a good point. And so just to clarify what you were saying is that, we do need to build that capacity, and from what you were saying, we need to look at the state federal dynamic and understand that the states are going to have their different correct me if I'm wrong, the states have to have more stringent regulations than the federal, correct?
There's a minimum level that is the federal regulation, yes, and then states can have more stringent than that if they want. The challenge, what varies a lot actually, is more the implementation. And so how much enforcement happens at the state level varies a lot. And so some places it can be easier to get by with shirking required permit laws and things like that.
And Stephanie, last but not least, you're going to get the last word here. Can we develop marine aquaculture responsibly in the US now?
Yeah, so I also think that we can, but I think it is going to take a commitment to do the hard work of really thinking through what structures and processes we need. And one big consideration that we haven't touched on that I think is really important for everyone involved in the conversation to be aware of or keep it front and center is that marine aquaculture is happening in public waters and this is a public space, and so it's very different from traditional agriculture that happens on private land. And so there's a lot of competing uses of ocean space, and while the ocean is really big, it's actually quite a busy place, and so marine aquaculture has to share that public space with other users, whether it's fishermen or recreational boaters or commercial shipping industry. And so that's a piece that sometimes gets lost in the conversation if environmental groups are engaged. Some others may think, well, why are they there, right? This is an industry conversation, but it's a public space that we all have a common interest in, and that we all need our federal, state, and local agencies to kind of work towards to protect that common space while allowing all the various activities that we want to happen, including marine aquaculture, to move forward.
And that is actually a perfect segue. So I want to thank Nicola, Stephanie, and Sean for taking the time to join us today to talk about the U.S. environmental regulatory environment and marine aquaculture. But this is just one of several discussions that we're having in this series, including siting and marine spatial planning. So thank you, Stephanie, for teeing that up for us. We will also be looking at seafood and marine aquaculture in the context of climate change, nutrition and food security, and many, many other topics. So please do go to aquariumofthepacific.org to see a full list of the series discussions, and again, for the bios and resources discussed in this session. Thank you.
you